This video made possible by the Global Innovation Exchange. Visit gixnetwork.org to learn more.
Thanks, everyone. I'm really excited about the next discussion. It's always good right after lunch to have a nice, lighthearted chat. But obviously, these issues couldn't be more pressing. They couldn't be more important. I thought one place to start is we're like 34 days away from the election. Where are we? What should we be worried about? Are we putting our attention in the right places? So, quick state of the union, if you will. Where are we right now? Either one of you.
Short answer there. I mean, I think one of the things to bear in mind is we talk about these issues often in terms of elections. But what we actually know is that these are ongoing threats. The kinds of attacks that we're seeing on our democratic institutions from adversaries like Russia, increasingly from others like China, is that these are ongoing attacks on our institutions. Elections are one really important institution in any democracy. There's many different ways and vectors to attack an election system, including the election infrastructure itself. But especially when we talk about the information operations that we've seen that have been the subject of so much conversation and congressional hearings, is that in fact actually they increased after the November 2016 elections. They've been ongoing, and many of them don't actually have anything to do with candidates at all. They're really about dividing Americans against each other. So the threats are ongoing. In terms of what to do about them, I mean, I think we have a better understanding, than we did in November of 2016 about what the threats are. I think we've had a lot of conversation about what to do about them. But in terms of State of the Union, what have we actually done to address those threats? Both government and the private sector, in my view, have done very little.
Emilian, you're on the front lines of this too, from advising folks and seeing what's going on. What are you seeing more of? Is it actual attacks on the system itself, people trying to hack into voter databases or election systems, or is it the kind of stuff that Laura's talking about in terms of attacks on the freedom of information, attacks on what we perceive to be the American conversation from people pretending to be Americans?
Right. I think we're seeing all of the above, but it's the right place to start in terms of gauging also the answer to your first question, which is how far have we come, is just trying to parcel out the problem into those pieces. I think most of the attention, so first of all, I agree that this is not just about point-in-time elections. There is a broader thing happening here, and that applies to the information operations and social media, and it applies to organizations getting hacked. So we've spent a fair bit of attention and energy since 2016, though, focused on really two problems. One is information operations, specifically with regard to social media companies. I think we're going to see that broaden out, and I think we'll see all this kind of information manipulation and impacts on our privacy and our information environment affecting other sectors too. And then we've also spent a lot of time at least talking about voting machines, were votes hacked, were votes changed. And so what I would call attention to here is that the problem is actually much broader than that. It's not just about were votes hacked or not. It's also about voter registration rules. It's about campaign operations. It's about get out the vote operations. All of these things are IT-driven. And so all of these are vulnerable, and we need to make sure we're not just focused on solving the problems that happened in 2016, that's hard enough, but also what could happen next.
And really, it sounds like there's a bunch of different things that we need to suss out that are each individually serious threats, and obviously they're all taken collectively, but we have, voter registration, election systems, get out the vote operations, and the internal security. Those are maybe the specifically electoral, if you will, set of canvases. Then we have, on the information side, we have everything from, media, you have fake social media campaigns, you have just efforts, and I think, we were talking backstage, it's not just about the election, it's just this idea of sowing discord generally. How important is that one? Let's take that one for a second. How important is just the idea of sowing division in the eyes of our adversaries?
I think it's incredibly important. I mean, to be a foreign policy wonk for 1 second. I know we're at GeekWire, but I'm a foreign policy wonk, and so if we think about what Vladimir Putin's goal is, for instance, Russia is a declining power. Putin is facing an economy that's in decline. He's trying to sort of restore Russia to its previous greatness, and the only way to do that is by weakening others. And one of the best ways to weaken us as a country is to literally attack our democratic foundations, to hinder our ability to get anything done, to have the kinds of discourse that's necessary in order to be able to make progress as a nation, to focus on the real threats we face, and instead focus on our problems at home. The reality is we do a pretty good job of polarizing ourselves. We have a lot of challenges in our country that are real, that are of our own creation, that we need to be addressing. But our adversaries are exploiting them through these kinds of steps. And the kind of discord you're talking about is, I think people think about this as in, it's just something that sort of happens online, and it's about either, false information, or it's about conspiracy theories. But if we look at sort of not only what happened in 2016, but some of the more recent takedowns that we've seen from Facebook and Twitter and Google and others, a lot of this effort is actually aimed at encouraging people to take real-world action. So organizing protests, right? A sort of Russian troll, I know this sounds crazy, but like sitting in St. Petersburg, creating a fake protest. And
a counter-protest.
And a counter-protest. So in Houston in 2016, we saw 2 protests organized, same day, same time, opposite sides of the street, 2 different sides of an issue. One was sort of, organizing in favor of Muslim rights. The other was sort of a Texas secessionist, but was basically sort of across from a mosque, saying basically like anybody who's Muslim doesn't belong here kind of deal. These were real people that showed up, hundreds of them, to these 2 protests, having no idea that they were organized to be there on that day, opposing each other by people who were not American at all and had no interest in the actual issues that they were protesting. So, we think actually the goal of that particular event was to try to spark violence. And I think that's one of the greatest concerns actually is what would happen if we do see violence break out at that kind of event. The other point I just wanted to make quickly, Ina, on your point about the different threads and how these are different, they do also come together and they do intersect. So one of the things that we see right now in some of the work that my team does to track Russian information operations is that they are actually pushing, amplifying stories, real content, about the vulnerabilities that our election systems face, about the things that Emilian was talking about the fact that our government has not taken necessary action to secure our systems. And the goal of Russian information operations amplifying that is to sow doubt in the election systems themselves. Elections are a system that rely on trust, and you don't actually have to change the votes in order to undermine people's faith in the outcome of an election.
Yeah, I mean, that's an important and a really worthy point, is that once you show that you can do something, just the fact that you can do it casts doubt. You've got this twofold issue. One, sowing doubt in the minds of Americans, and then once you've sown that doubt actually is almost self-fulfilling in that you don't really have to do anything, and people are going to be questioning. I mean, it seems to me that one of the issues is that no matter what happens in 2018, in the elections, in the midterms, somebody's probably going to win more than they thought, somebody's going to do worse than they thought, and inevitably, somebody is going to think there was foul play whether there was or not.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. We also face a challenge that it's going to spread across both parties. So right now, for the most part, the narrative has been that Democratic candidates and Democratic operations suffered because of Russian interference to date, and that the Democratic Party has been much more vocal about trying to solve this problem, and with a few exceptions on the Republican side.
We're full service here.
Thank you, this is lovely.
Anyone else?
Great. I'm gonna take a second then.
So
I was just
that's
say
actually
that
my technique to cut you off. I ply you with water.
Right.
No.
And yet, here I am. So I would just say that in 2018, what we could see is candidates on both the left and the right helped in much greater number, and the party's actually kind of riven apart by this challenge.
The other piece that I think, we've talked about the way that once doubt is sown, the impact that has. The other thing, and you alluded this too, is we're doing a pretty good job of dividing ourselves. And how much are we playing right into the hands of those who want to divide us by working so hard to divide ourselves? I mean, it strikes me that even the issue of election interference is a completely partisan issue in the United States. How crazy is it that the notion of whether our elections are being interfered with is itself a completely political issue, and where people tend to view it tends to be their political belief more than anything else?
To me, coming out of the national security world, it's stunning to have witnessed an attack on our country in which we have responded not by coming together, but by allowing ourselves to be torn apart. I mean, you heard in the introduction, I was Hillary Clinton's foreign policy advisor, but for the work that I do, that we're talking about here today, I teamed up with Marco Rubio's former foreign policy advisor, because I believe deeply that the only way to address these issues is in a bipartisan, united manner. And the more we allow ourselves to be driven apart by these issues, the more that either party uses this for partisan advantage, or that hides behind partisan, bumper stickers or banners around this issue, the more it's going to make us more vulnerable and give the advantage to those who are trying to harm our country.
And I'll just add, bear in mind, that problem manifested itself even before the election.
That's right.
So before the election, the administration knew what was going on. They knew what Russia was doing. President Obama wanted to warn the country and wanted to do it in a bipartisan manner, and reached out to Republicans, as well as Democrats, of course, to try to do that. Head of the DNC was reaching out to the RNC saying, let's warn people about what's happening. And it was largely Republican leaders at that time who said, if you come out with this warning and that the DNC breach was related to Russia, we will show that that is a political argument that you're making. And so the Democrats, I think, in the administration were caught between a rock and a hard place. That might turn around and go the other way next time, but it became a partisan issue even before the election happened.
Is there a way out of that? Is there a way to make foreign interference? I mean, it sounds, again, I'm laughing at myself saying this. Is there a way to make a foreign attack on our country seem like an issue that unites us and to have a united response, or are we just so divided politically that literally every issue, from whether there's climate change to rape to Nazis, is now a partisan issue?
So I'm the eternal optimist, and I believe that there is a way to do that. Some of this is going to be like boring policy talk for a second, but there's things that you can do, like legislating mandatory reporting requirements on the government and the intelligence community to report to the public and Congress when there is evidence of interference in our democracy, right? By making that a mandatory legal requirement, you take it out of the hands of partisan calculations, out of the hands of politicians, and you make it a requirement, right? That's one very sort of wonky way of doing things. There are other things. I mean, frankly, restoring, it doesn't help that we have a president who casts doubt on the intelligence community. It doesn't help that we have a president who casts doubt on law enforcement. But if we trust law enforcement, if we trust the intelligence community to be a voice that is reporting the facts, which is traditionally, and I believe what they still do, then we can also have a voice to expose these things. I mean, one of the things, I've spent a lot of time studying how European countries that have been on the front lines of some of these tactics from Russia for quite some time, how they respond. Exposure of these operations, sunlight, transparency is one of the best antidotes to dealing with these tactics. And so having credible voices making clear what's happening is incredibly important. And I will give kudos here to the Trump administration, actually, because Rod Rosenstein announced a policy almost 2 months ago at Aspen about the Department of Justice being very forward-leaning, not only on cracking down on interference activities, but in publicly exposing them as well. And President Trump signed an executive order. And people question his motives on that, but the reality is that in that executive order, he said the intelligence community will provide a report after elections saying if there was evidence of interference. And those are steps. Again, I'm the eternal optimist over here who wants to grab onto anything, but I think we can get there.
So I want to broaden this out beyond elections in a second, but before we leave elections and sort of the broader surrounding discussions around elections, we've talked about the government, we've talked about governments and the political response. What about the platforms? We hear a lot, almost every week, Facebook or Twitter is holding a call with my colleagues and myself saying, we found more stuff, and here's all the things we're doing. How are the platforms doing? How Are things more secure now? Are they doing better, or are they just know it's an issue, so they want to convince us they're on top of it?
That's your area.
So we've gone from this is crazy, the idea that foreign actors could have used our platform for this, right, which is what Mark Zuckerberg said in November of 2016, to now a real acknowledgement of the fact that this is happening, right? Sheryl Sandberg testified before the Senate Intelligence Committee a few weeks ago and said, this is real, the threat is there, and we have to do better. The problem is, after we have to do better, there's still a lack of real specifics of what that means. And I think that there are huge steps that still need to be taken, in some cases that are pretty fundamental to how the platforms operate, where they've not yet been willing to go. Now, each platform's different and all that, but I'll make 2 points on this. One is, I'm going to look at my phone for a second because I'm going to read a quote that is from Alex Stamos, who was the former CSO at Facebook. And in an internal post that he wrote earlier this year, many of you may know about this, that then later got leaked out, he said 2 things that really stood out to me as we think about these threats going forward and how we all miss the fact that social media could be used for these purposes. He said 2 things. One, he said a lot of things, but 2 things I think are important for this. One is we need to adjust to reward not shipping when that is the wiser decision. And then he said we need to think adversarial in every process, product, and engineering decision we make. I think that the pack and ship model, the move fast and break things, the idea of speed, and we will address downside risks, after something's in the wild when we identify them. We have seen pretty clearly here where that becomes an enormous vulnerability and liability. And so I think there are policy steps that need to be taken by the platforms. There are operational steps that need to be taken by the platforms, but I think there are, frankly, cultural steps as well.
Can I jump in on that?
Please.
So what Alex Stamos said applies excellently not only to social media companies, which we were just talking about, but to another private sector part of the election security equation, and that is the voting machines. And I don't want to fixate on that problem, but it is important. And I don't want to say it's all doom and gloom and everything's insecure, because then I'm playing in the hands of the Russians, who want us to have no confidence in our systems. But there is a real problem with voting infrastructure. And there was a great reporting on this in the past week by Kim Zetter, which is a terrific piece that everyone should read in New York Times Magazine. Across the country, there are over 300,000 voting machines. 80% of them are built by 3 companies that are loosely regulated and that, as far as we can tell, have not adopted the couple of recommendations that Alex Stamos just gave to the social media community. And they've come under significantly less scrutiny in the public eye and in Congress. And so looking at those 3 companies that are supporting all of our voting infrastructure, are not engaging proactively with the hacker community, are not opening up their software to vulnerability assessments and to evaluations, are not providing the basic requirements for good auditing after an election to know if something did happen. That, to me, is another place where the private sector has abandoned its responsibilities, and regulation would make sense.
And I want to now broaden the conversation. We've talked a lot about how this is impacting our voting and our elections. But voting and elections are an important part of our democracy, a critical part of our democracy. But there are other pieces of it, from trusting what we read in the media to healthy discussions to whether we feel safe walking down the street, which to some degree is relevant to what sort of discord is being sown. What are the things that we're paying attention to in the electoral sphere that we should actually be thinking about more broadly? What are some of the things that you study that are really deeper conversations that we should be having as a country?
I'll jump in and say that I think we are starting to really understand that when it comes to social media platforms, the expression, if you're not the customer, if you're not paying, you are the product, and that our data, my data and my attention, and your data and your attention, is what these platforms are actually commoditizing and using. I think we now know that about Facebook and YouTube and Twitter. I think that phenomenon, which directly impacts on our privacy and on our ability to make decisions, is going to spread to other sectors more than it already has beyond social media. So I would be looking at every single vertical, and its healthcare, and its smart homes, and its financial services, and down the list, transportation, looking at how we are thinking about our privacy, what they can collect, and then what they can analyze across platforms, how they can make decisions about us and influence us to make decisions.
And I'm kind of doom and gloom when it comes to the privacy side of things, because having covered this on and off for 20 years, my sense is that the American public cares about privacy for approximately a nanosecond, which is not long enough for any real change to occur. Basically, privacy scandal happens, people are outraged, Congress says they're going to have hearings. By the time those hearings happen, Americans have forgot, very little changes, and rinse, repeat, et cetera. Even, to me, the classic example of this is Equifax, a company that literally we weren't even their customer. They somehow have all this private data that we never gave them as individuals. That data gets leaked, and nothing changes. How do we begin to have a conversation around data? Is there an opportunity for that? I mean, they're doing it in Europe, but they've always had a stronger belief in both privacy and that one's data belongs to them.
Yeah, I think that we're starting to see that conversation happening. But I think that you're right to say, like, what are the lessons we can take, or what are the issues we're talking about in the election context that we can think about more broadly? When I think about not just sort of the threats that we've seen, but what threats of the future might be, I look at China and its development of AI coupled with facial recognition technology, coupled with a social credit score that's going to decide how its citizens, where they fall in the ranking of priorities for doctor's appointments based on how many times they've been caught jaywalking by facial recognition cameras, and I'm not exaggerating on that point.
Sort of like precision medicine meets racial profiling.
Exactly, yeah. Meets complete and total social control. Right? You couple that, by the way, with the Great Firewall and all the censorship that happens, which, by the way, is not only happening just now within China, but China is starting to push the borders of the Great Firewall outside of China to conduct censorship on its platforms outside of Chinese borders, as well as to force American companies to change how they talk about things that are sensitive, quote, to China. And this relates to data in the sense of, let me just paint a couple doom and gloom pictures for you to stop being the eternal optimist for a second. Russia engages in information manipulation by casting doubt on the truthfulness of information, by distorting the information architecture, using computational propaganda and good old school just propaganda. In the Chinese model, you don't actually really have to, introduce new specific narratives in any way. You can just control the entire information space, deny information space to people you don't want in it, and censor out what you don't want there as well. It's almost like you would never even know that anything has been changed because your reality has just been shaped by the information bubble that they have placed around you. And then you think about things like, you want to talk about Americans' own data. Well, I'm going to venture to guess that there are some people in this room who are on the app Grindr. Well, do you know that Grindr is now owned by a Chinese media company with a Chinese CEO? And while they have said that your data is still protected, you better believe that that Chinese company has ties with the Chinese Communist Party that's going to put leverage on them to try to get access to that data. What does that mean from a security perspective? What does that mean from a privacy perspective? Those are questions that we need to be wrestling with. Now, whether we're going to get to the point soon enough before, frankly, it's too late, I don't know.
So all that, plenty to chew on, plenty for us to work on. I want to throw one more into the mix. One of the big topics, obviously, is artificial intelligence. There's a number of issues around AI, from ethics and how do you make sure you remove algorithmic bias and all these things. Great fodder for another discussion. But I did want to get into one point related to AI, which is, there's this sense that, well, it's not just a sense, it is true that the more data you have, the better AI systems work. China, because of its attitudes towards privacy, has a tremendous amount of data. How much does it matter that they have so much data? And then I have a related follow-up that we talked about a little backstage. But starting with just, does it matter? Is it important that China has all this facial recognition data and can train its AI better in theory than we can?
So there's a debate in the AI community on this, and I'm not an AI expert, to be clear. I just pretend to be one sometimes.
Play one on the GeekWire
Yeah, I'm sure
stage.
there are many people in this room who could answer this question better than I could. And Emilian probably has thoughts as well. But I would just say, I do believe that there are definite advantages that China has in the short run as well as in the long run. And I think the long run here is particularly important because if you look at things like, it's not just what China has within its own borders. You look at the digital Silk Road, the literal digital and telecommunications track that China is building in Africa, in Latin America, in Central and Eastern Europe. The platforms that it is providing, both in terms of the hardware and the data that it's collecting from them. China's actually had at one point they ran into a problem that other sort of AI enterprises have had as well, which is not having enough diversity of data. So they literally went out and made a point of getting more African data so they could have more diverse data. And because of the way that China's model operates, I think they're going to have significant leverage to gain real data sources, including through their huge expansion into 5G.
I think there's certainly an advantage there. At the same time, there's value, there is importance in the long run to values, and so you can't just look at what other countries are doing and follow suit, right? And so maybe I'm preempting your question.
You are, and that's where I was going to go next. So I was setting up this issue that is important of, clearly we are in a battle. It's a global battle for technology, dominance, supremacy, what have you. Clearly that cyber advantage is huge. And China, because of the way that as a culture they view privacy and data, does have this inherent ability to collect way more, way faster. The flip side to that is, as we're trying to combat that, is it important that we do that in a way that's consistent with our values? And I'll throw out one thing that I've been hearing increasingly. I have yet to hear tech companies say this loudly in public, but I have them say it kind of quietly all the time. Whenever they're questioned on a data collection practice, the sort of, there's the official response, and then there's the, if we weren't doing this, the Chinese would do it anyway. How worrisome is that as a perennial boogeyman for a tech company to throw out there to do whatever it wants?
Right. So I'm not terribly worried about the fact that China has more data, and we're going to get a lot of data. There's plenty of it. I worry about the boogeyman effect because it would lead to tech companies being more unbridled and pushing back on regulation. But there is plenty more to worry about here at home in the US, and since I'm Canadian, in North America, and in the kind of liberal democracies generally. You mentioned facial recognition, and you've talked about how are we doing handling privacy issues. The thing that worries me most, and since we're coming to this great conference, it's all about building things, and then the three of us are talking about the terrible things that can happen, is our use of our kind of reckless abandon with regard to biometric data, using biometrics for authentication, allowing people to pick up biometrics, and everyone's fixated on protecting these social security numbers, which by the way are gone. They've all been hacked. And we're not focused on privacy around biometrics, privacy around other kinds of data that gets observed about us. Those, to me, are bigger problems than keeping our eye on the other guy in the race for AI.
I mean, that's super helpful. I mean, one of the things I want to ask you, now that we've thrown out all these different topics, I mean, who in here is kind of overwhelmed? Whose takeaway from this is, wow, we're just kind of messed over, we're under attack from ourselves, from the Russians, the Chinese, who so far in this conversation feels more overwhelmed? If you feel more overwhelmed than when we started 25 minutes ago, raise your hand. Okay.
We missed a couple.
If you feel like you have a better handle on where we go from here, raise your hand. Okay, so we have 5 minutes left, and no one feels like they have a better handle on things. So great, I've done my job. No. One of the things I think we sorely need is focus, is what should we be paying attention to? If you could have a national dialogue on one or two key topics, what would you have us taking seriously and discussing right now? Maybe I'll start with you, Emilian, and then Laura.
Sure. So Laura and I were saying that this was great to come to GeekWire because we spend the vast majority of our time at security conferences talking to security people. And there are a whole bunch of problems with that. But it's great to be here with a much broader part of society talking about security issues. To me, the answer to your question is not about security people deciding, should we be worried about voting infrastructure or about social media or about AI, because the answer is they're all important. The solution lies in everybody else here, the not security people for the most part, thinking about what Laura quoted Alex Stamos as saying, which is privacy by design, security by design, and incorporating an awareness of risks and a desire to mitigate those risks into everything that is being built, everything that's being talked about in IoT and healthcare at GeekWire. Every company is an IT company, and as Microsoft's Nadella said yesterday, non-tech companies are hiring vastly more developers than the tech companies are, and at a faster rate. So every company is an IT company. Every company is going to be a software company. If we can get every company from the get-go, when they're thinking about that new product, thinking about that new platform, to bring the secure design people into the room and figure out how to bake this stuff securely from the beginning, thinking about risks to confidentiality, thinking about disruption, and all the other bad things that can happen, then I think across society we'll have a much greater force working to mitigate these risks than if it's just a tiny security community worrying about these problems on their own.
Look.
Yeah, I think this is going to sound really corny, but I think some of it actually, from where I sit, goes back to having a national dialogue about why democracy matters and why values matter, and why, as we develop as a country going forward, that is core to who we are, right? When I worked in government, my oath was to defend the Constitution of the United States against threats foreign and domestic. That is the oath that every public servant in this country takes. And why is it that we swear to a constitution? It's because this country is founded on values and beliefs. And I think that some of this is, we've all sort of forgotten sometimes about why all those things matter. And we go about living our daily lives, and we want convenience, and we want security, and we forget sort of where some of the rub is on these issues, and we forget why these things matter. So some of it is I think, actually like a back to first principles kind of conversation. I could not agree more with Emilian on the importance of having these dialogues between communities that haven't always talked to each other very well. I was working at the White House during the Snowden revelations, so I felt very directly from the White House seat the just fissure that happened with Silicon Valley in that moment, right? We also experienced another fissure across the transatlantic divide as well that were, so we were sort of working to heal that in both directions. That trust gap between government and the private sector is really, I think, hindering our ability to wrestle with some of these challenges in a meaningful way. I'm sure many of you watched some of the social media hearings, the Mark Zuckerberg's hearings in particular earlier this summer. They were not a good display about policymakers who know what they're talking about. We've got to fix that, toot sweet. If we're gonna, these are hard questions. Even for people who understand these issues, they are hard questions. They involve serious trade-offs. But we need people in the policy and security world who are educated on technology. We need people in the technology world who are educated on security threats and on policy. We need that cross-fertilization to be able to have these real discussions and actually sort of make meaningful change.
And it seems like we've only gotten one step of the way. So when I started at Axios 2 years ago, my boss, Jim Vandehei, was like, write a column, have it talk about what Silicon Valley needs to know about DC, what DC needs to know about Silicon Valley. And I was like, well, there's a fallacy there, which is Silicon Valley doesn't care about DC. They hire 3 people in Washington so they can continue doing what they're doing without paying a whit of attention. And I think that was true at that moment. It's been less true every day since. Obviously, people care a lot about it now. But to your point, they're going and testifying. There's a dialogue, but it's a please don't legislate me, or at least legislate me nicely. It's not a how can we work together.
That's right.
So maybe the takeaway is the next step is for tech and government to actually figure out ways to work together. Well, I hope in that last 5 minutes, I don't think we solved everything, but I think maybe we pointed the direction of the discussion. Obviously, to be continued. I'd love to come back a year from now and see if we're better off, less well off, or non-existent, or maybe our Russian bots can have that discussion for us. If you'll join me in thanking the panel, a lot to think about. Thank you.